The DCU is upon us, and to commemorate that, McFarlane delivers not one, not two, but three David Corenswet Superman figures. And we're going to be comparing all three, so stick around. And to an extent, it's kind of important that we do, because not only are we entering what is being speculated very strongly by myself and some other folks within the McFarlane Toys community of what could be the last year of the DC license for McFarlane Toys. That's kind of almost symbolized to a certain extent by the fact that the DC Multiverse symbol on the boxes for this brand new series of the Superman movie figures are boasting the new DCU Studios like symbol for DC right on top of it. It still says Multiverse, but you'll notice that they kind of changed things up a little bit right there. And I'm curious to see if that's going to be across the board or only for very specific DCU figures or DC Studios related figures. Nevertheless, it is a very interesting turn of the tide, so to speak, moving forward, considering that not only will we be getting a much more affordable pared down version of the Corenswet Superman to be a Ross exclusive, and I'm eager to see how that goes as far as price, as far as release schedule, what it's going to entail. But for now, we're dealing with, first, the very basic $22.99 to $23.99, depending on where you pick him up from, basic version of the Corenswet Superman from the DC Multiverse wave. And here he is at the 7-inch scale, DC Multiverse scale. And I've often remarked before that McFarlane is kind of hit or miss when it comes to real live action counterparts to his action figures, where sometimes the likeness could be a little off, it could be a little exaggerated or not congruent enough to look similar to the actor, and then other times they hit it right out of the park. My personal experiences with that would have to be the Morgan Freeman Lucius Fox figure, and then even though I never picked him up because I never had a great affinity for the character, whenever I would pass the Black Adam Dwayne Johnson figure in the store, God damn it, that looked exactly like him. So color me incredibly curious when I wanted to see what McFarlane's take was going to be on the new live-action James Gunn Superman, considering not only the likeness, but also the interpretation of the suit, which overall, I genuinely do like the Frankenstein approach to the suit, where they took the symbol from Kingdom Come, but then kind of it swapped out some of the color scheming as far as not having the black, but instead having the traditional mustard yellow. The undies are back, but then you have some patterns and linings to the suit that looked unique for Superman, but a lot of people were making references to the Guardians of the Galaxy suits that he incorporated in his trilogy of films. But then you have the yellow symbol on the back of the cape returning, and then other little things. The color is now much more pronounced, etc., etc. So bringing it to the McFarlane Toys DC Multiverse scaling as far as solid build quality and kind of coming up with much more unique sculpts that speak much more to not only the height, because David Corenswet, he's kind of a tall guy. In fact, he's almost screen accurate to what you expect Superman to be. I believe he is in fact 6'4", much like his comic book counterpart. And I generally do feel a sense of that scale coming through with the way that the legs and the arms and even the torso piece is sculpted. When it comes to the little lines and the little details and textures sculpted on the surface of the body, for the most part, it's done pretty well and pretty accurate as far as the little linings that you can kind of make out here on the shoulders, the biceps, the forearms, kind of coiling and stretching out via the wrists right here. And then further more of that happening alongside the side here of the thighs, the legs, and then most especially the boots. If anything, it's when we get to the red parts of the suit that kind of make up a few of the parts that are, in my opinion, my favorites as far as the semi-matted finish to the boots. The boots, for some strange reason, feel really good in hand, and I like the little cutout divot here towards the top that is very specific to this version of the suit. And to an extent, I can almost say that about the diaper piece, because I feel like the diaper piece is going to be a point of contention here, considering that the underoos are returning for Superman's attire, except here in DC Multiverse McFarlane format, they are slightly on the baggy side. And I do kind of wish that a little bit of QC control, or rather quality assurance, or QC assurance, because I don't want to be redundant here, was paid a little bit more attention when coming out of the assembly line, because you'll note that a little bit of red paint drip is happening where the belt should be a little bit more uniformal. And I guess this is a good way to kind of segue into my main problem with the standard version of the DC Multiverse Corenswet Superman, is that when I mentioned before about like likenesses and having things be very solid coming right out of the box, there is a little bit of this skepticism, this sort of almost fear coming out of me when hunting for this guy because I've already come across him a couple of times. But frankly, this exact unit that I'm holding in my hand is technically, I want to say, the fifth or sixth guy that I willingly took off the peg and brought home with me. Because there were a couple of others where there were much worse QC issues happening that I can easily pick apart from the outside of the box, as far as paint applications being a little misaligned, some of which had even worse occasions, worse instances of this sort of paint drip that's happening with the utility belt, and then other scenarios where you have maybe some misalignment happening with the yellow symbol or the chest emblem happening here, little black specks on the face, and other things that were happening that made me want to kind of take my chances and just kind of leave that particular unit to then go on a much more extended hunt and trying to find a different unit that at least looked a little bit more quality controlled. And this is arguably the best scenario or the best figure that I was able to pick out from the bunch. And even then, you'll still have occasional little moments, like I mentioned already, the utility belt, or if we are to rotate it towards the back here, you'll notice that we have the yellow symbol here, which in my opinion is legitimately sculpted onto the rubber part of the cape beautifully, and for the most part it's painted very well done. But you'll notice that you have just a tiny little speck that is quite honestly grafted onto the middle part, and I can't scratch it off right there without risking damaging any of the paint. So that's obviously something that I'm not going to be able to see quite clearly considering that's on the back. But while I'm back here, one thing that took me incredibly by surprise is, in my opinion, the rubberized cape. I know that we're at a point where we should probably be chastising the utilization of rubberized capes, considering that we're now moving on to cloth capes, and to see that a standard edition of a figure is now resorting back to rubberized capes and saving the cloth cape for that theatrical deluxe edition, which we'll get to momentarily in this comparison. I'd argue that yes, there is a little bit of ethics to be put into question where I'm like, you're taking something and kind of labeling it as premium, but then you have other releases within this same exact price point that are now having the cloth capes. So I'm like, what exactly, I don't know if this is like a WB thing or a McFarlane thing. Only those who were in the meeting, inside of that room during the meeting was concocted, will then know the genuine answer. But for now, it is a little questionable as to why it is that we have a rubberized cape with this basic release that you could find traditionally in most stores, and we'll probably have much more available units to be able to pick up from the pegs. With that said, the sculpting and texture work happening with the cape is actually pretty nice. There's certain instances where if I kind of lift this up a little bit and kind of hold it in a certain amount of place, it's tailored and sculpted to come down this line that doesn't feel terrible in hand. It doesn't feel like a very rigid monstrosity. It doesn't feel like it doesn't complement the figure. The only little nitpick I have is that considering that it's going back to its rubber roots, it does have problems with that little plastic slit pulling it out of the package that could potentially cause a little bit of damage during that unboxing process. You'll note that by the little bit of pinching that is happening on the left side right here. But if you're able to look past that, I would say that the rubberized cape is complementing the overall proportions of the body really well done. And considering how lucky I got, the chest emblem here on the center is done beautifully. As far as I mentioned before, the paint applications, very similar to the yellow symbol on the cape. It's grafted on and sculpted very beautifully there in the center of the chest piece, along with the little lines and texture that's working for the main broad shoulders of the suit. This overall is my favorite part, but at the same time, it kind of comes back to bite the figure just a little bit of the ass, because despite kind of praising a little bit of that proportionality of giving us the very larger-than-life presence of a new version of Superman, I'd argue that maybe the head is just a little bit small. It's once we get to the head, and it's probably because of the longer neck stump here, that if I was to pick apart any areas of the proportions, it would either be a little bit of the forearms that leaves us with these slightly stubby wrists and hands that feel a little bit short, a little T-Rexy from a certain angle. There's certain angles where the arms come off a little T-Rex and a little stumpy. But then, to me, the biggest problem would have to be some slight shrinkage happening with the head. Which is a shame because, again, despite my numerous attempts of picking up a really well done sculpt, I managed to find, in my opinion, one of the more handsomer likenesses to David Cornsweet in the likeness that is sculpted onto this figure. I genuinely do see the actor. It's, again, not the strongest likeness. You're probably going to have to turn your eyes to some other prosumer companies should they ever take their turn on the new James Gunn version of Superman, whether it be Mayfix, Figuarts. I mean, hell, even Fonjoy said that they're going to be doing a Cornsweet Superman, even though their head sculpt is questionable in and of themselves. But at least here, I would argue that for a McFarlane $23 to $25 figure, it's doing a pretty good job. But again, I would urge to still double check your figures when you're going out there hunting, because not only have I personally come across some where the head was, again, either had a couple of QC problems with like some black specks grafted onto the face, but then you've had some other people reporting on social media like Reddit and Twitter and Facebook with documented photos showing one of their eyes being completely cocked off to the side and completely misaligned. So double check your figures and make sure that the head sculpt is as close to the likeness as possible, like I was able to luck out here with really good pronunciation of the jaw, the mouth right here, and the way that the eyes are kind of bringing the whole likeness together, along with the little curl here on the side of the hairline, as well as the hair being slicked back. Overall, it's a really great sculpt. Just wish that it was just a little bit bigger to kind of bring everything together, because it does make the body seem a little more elongated than it should have. So we're almost teetering on a really great representation of the Cornsweet Superman as far as the overall static nature of the figure here in just a very neutral pose. But if you want to make him take flight, you can resort to the articulation for that. Now, that does, however, come with its own share of little misgivings, a few little issues that I managed to point out. One of which is that they did manage to slightly overpaint the head sculpt as well as the neck stump underneath, because when you do turn the head 360 degrees, it's achievable, but you hear the amount of squeaking happening, and that's because of the way that everything is just painted with layers of texture work happening there that is kind of scraping and grafting up against itself. And that in turn also results in some slightly limited nudging and tilting upwards and downwards. I feel like this is not necessarily one of the most flexible joints as far as any kind of like tilting, looking up, looking down, or even tilting the head side to side. It's virtually unachievable, and I don't know if that's because this is a very similar head sculpt or, mechanism that they had to tool together that they will have to more or less copy and paste for the Theatrical Deluxe edition. So that's something, that's a bridge that we will most definitely cover when we get to that iteration of this particular McFarlane. With the arms, you are able to rotate them 360 degrees in place as well as extend them off to the side. Now you'll note that the washer here on the left is allowing some flexible, and obviously I'm not talking about the washer, but rather the dumbbell joint from within. But the washer is at least illustrating movement in the butterfly and shrugging motion. But frankly, I can only really find that for the left shoulder. The right shoulder doesn't really do that. I don't know if mine is stuck or if something is causing it to be limited. I almost want to attribute this to being an isolated incident, and I think I have an idea as to why. But for the time being, the biceps on either arm can fully rotate the full 360 degrees, no problem. Although the one on my right is actually a little bit on the stiffer side, but I feel like that's a problem that could easily be fixed with a hairdryer. Two elbow joints that can fully bend all the way up, and the wrist joint found inside is nevertheless a ball. Actually, no, it's not a ball joint. It's kind of a ball joint, but it's kind of cupped into the wrist, very snug, that it can definitely allow pivoting upwards and downwards very firmly, as well as allowing the hand to fully rotate on the little rod that is stemming from the peg, the full 360 degrees, no problem. The mid-torso joint, though, is really, really nice as far as the full rotation 360 degrees in place. Just mind the cape a little bit, but extension towards the back is pretty decent. It's not the best, but it gets the job done. Crunching downwards, though, it just ever so slightly nudges, but at least side-to-side oblique movement is a little bit more complementary. And if you want to go a little further, you can find that in the waist joint, which allows further extension forwards, backwards, and side-to-side. Very, very fluid. Not much in the way of waist rotation. It feels like the peg. Actually, you know what? Screw it. It can be done. Okay. You just got to give it an extra little push because it is a little firm and even kind of like a smoother ratcheted rotation happening right there, but it can be achieved. So full 360 movement on the diaper piece right there, as well as further inclination. So it's a little bit more complementary than that of the mid-torso cut, but better flexibility could be found there. Top leg joints can allow the leg to extend forwards about that far, as well as extension towards the back. Pretty generous as far as extension, almost at the kind of reaching the 180-degree angle more so than some other prior McFarlanes I've covered, so that's pretty nice. Of course, it comes at the trade-off of having a major gap between the crotch piece and the leg right there, so do be mindful of that. But at least extension towards the sides is pretty complementary as well, just kind of crumping a little bit of the diaper piece, so don't stress that too much because I feel like over time that could cause a little bit of wear and tear. But great segue. Speaking of wear and tear, we then get to our knee joints, which in my opinion comes up with the most objective misgiving or the most objective criticism I have towards the corn sweat Superman, which is that it's actually something that I haven't seen McFarlane do in quite a while. And that's going to be kind of like misaligning or miscalculating just how far you can press a joint past the plastic that you molded for the figure in and of itself, or at least coming up with like a thing that they just overlooked in the science of tooling this whole thing around, because you technically do have two knee joints that should allow the leg to bend all the way up. However, when I do that, it stops right about right there. And stopping the joint right there and not allowing further opposability is one thing. It's like, okay, well, it's a little limited, but it is what it is. It's another to then have the joint, or at least the top joint, cause wear and tear damage to the top part of the leg. You'll notice right there, a little bit of the blue starting to brighten up and warp towards the back right here. And I've dealt with some McFarlane Batman figures that had a similar issue where I stressed the joint and just very, in the most sensitive manner, stress the plastic because it's so thin here at the edge that it caused it to warp and brighten up like that. And it's a shame because by technical definition, that is a damage onto the figure that's caused by what is traditionally a regular function of the figure. So I'm sorry, but that's something that needs to be pointed out in a review. And it's been a good minute since it's happened to a McFarlane that I covered on the channel, so that's kind of a good thing, but at the same time, to see it rear its ugly head once more, nevertheless on a movie license figure, it's a bit of a shame. At least on the bright side, I was complimenting the boots for having a really good feel to them. That feel continues with having, in my opinion, like I said, one of my favorite joints that they retooled and reinvented, so to speak, for their own personal line, as far as giving us this much more cylindrical, flush ankle joint that looks much more natural to the way ankles function on the bodies that they've given Superman and Batman figures, and therefore allows the foot to be able to bend all the way down like so. Feels very good, ratcheted in hand, and very firm and very tight, being able to extend the boot upwards like so, and even rotate at the top of the joint the full 360 degrees, or even incline and pivot the foot from the bottom of the joint. So it's pretty complementary there, and nevertheless, you also have toes that are fully able to bend all the way up there at the bottom. You can kind of make out that the articulation more or less passes the grade, but at the same time, there's little bits as far as the way that the plastic kind of warps behind the knee, as well as the overpainting that's happening with the head joint, that just reminds me a little bit too blatantly of movie license McFarlane figures. If anything, I don't know if some of you may wince at hearing this, but it kind of reminds me of like the Suicide Squad wave, or pick your poison, as far as like maybe even some of the Batman figures from The Batman, the 2022 movie, where sometimes certain joints feel a little overpainted. You pull the figure out of the box and it just reeks of that paint. It's like, we were almost kind of there, especially with, like I mentioned before, this new ankle joint that I'm a fan of, the tooling of the body. And one other thing that it even kind of harkens back to those traditional days of movie license McFarlane DC figures would have to be the accessories, which are just a pair of hands. Just your usual pair of Superman flight hands. Thankfully, they are proportional to the standard hands that he comes with. that have already kind of created a bit of buzz on social media because a lot of people are not a fan that he doesn't have a left fisted hand. He's only got a right fist and an open clawed left hand. But when it comes to symmetrical hands, he's only got the flight hands that are as bonus hands tossed in. Which, like I said, the bright side is that at least they're proportional, unlike the Page Puncher Shazam comic, where he's got the massive, giant, girthy hands. And much like the head, I feel like the joints are a little overpainted to where you kind of have to warm them up a little bit to be able to commit that swap, because a couple of times the whole joint came off when doing a little bit of the hand swap. But apart from that, the next major cardinal sin that, again, at this point, I might as well just let that ship sail, would have to be the absence of a flight stand. Once more, you're dealt with the black base and the trading card, no flight stand included. And on the one side, I would kind of make that argument for the standard edition that you can see a little bit too obviously posed over here on the left of the frame, because I do want to fill the right of the frame with the battle damage version, which is branded as the gold label Target exclusive variant. And you'll see that for the most part it's sculpted and tooled together almost identical to that of the standard release. So as far as the tooling of the body, the articulation, the way everything's kind of put together, and even some of the texture work and the molding of the plastic for the limbs, the body, the torso, the yellow symbol on the back, as well as the emblem, the chest emblem on the front, is more or less the same. But the elephant in the room would have to be the battle damage overlay of paint and deco given to the figure in and of itself. Some people have contested that technically, I would say I've seen a good amount of like 50-50 discussion of favoring the battle damage version better than the standard release. And I don't feel that strongly, but I don't blame anyone necessarily, because there are parts of the body, as far as the way that the limbs are kind of coated in dirt, the boots, and obviously where your eyes are going to gravitate towards the most, the chest symbol on the front, as well as the yellow symbol on the back of the cape, which in my opinion, I think is able to illustrate the battle damage the best. I don't know what it is, but there's something about the dirt and the grime and the black paint applications on the top part of the cape that then kind of creates a gradient effect bleeding on over the yellow symbol on the back that to me looks the best. And then a little bit of that wear and tear that's happening on the yellow symbol on the front, as well as the much more opaque approach to the blue for the overall ensemble. That's where, in my opinion, it works the best. Where it doesn't work the best, frankly, would have to be any of the dirt and the grime that they try to make it seem like it's apparent on any parts of the skin tone for the body, predominantly the hands and the face. I don't know what it is, but it just doesn't work 100%. And similar to what I was remarking about having to go through a handful of units to find one that looks much more well put together, a similar case, not to the same extent as the default guide, but to a certain extent, the same problem occurred with the battle damage version, where sometimes they went a little too far with the battle damage to where their whole, Corn Sweat's whole face was covered in dirt and grime, and I'm like, I just want a little bit off to the forehead and on the front side here, and not covering it to the point of making it seem like he's got 5 o'clock shadow. I don't want that necessarily, and I've managed to find a good, well-balanced head sculpt here as far as the battle damage is concerned, and I will give them credit for changing up a little bit of the expression. If you look a little more carefully, you'll notice that he is in fact frowning and having a much more focused, determined, but slightly aggro expression to the battle damage version versus the much more smiley and optimistic portrayal that he's got on the standard version. So I did like that they overhauled that, made it match the battle deco, and overall is at least doing something here. I just wish that, again, the similar thing could be said for some of the hand accessories, because they're more or less identical to that of the standard release. And that complaint about the battle damage and the dirt and grime being applied to skin tone parts of the overall body is also applied to the hand sculpts right here. Plus, if you notice, I was having just a little bit of difficulty standing him up. I don't know if like the soles of the feet are a little bit more curved on the battle damage than that of the standard release, but at least they're doing just enough here to where if you had to pick one between these two standard releases, I would still kind of pitch you the standard version, But if there's something that speaks to you as far as the battle damage deco of this gold label Target exclusive, I wouldn't necessarily blame you for picking that up. Just be careful when pulling him out of the box, because similar to the standard version, you have a little bit of that pinching and crimping happening with the rubberized cape, pulling him out of the box. But that's only really a problem if you're pulling it out of the box, because these guys are using rubberized capes. What about the one that's using a cloth cape? And here we have the Deluxe Theatrical Edition finally arriving from various retailers after initial waves made their way towards either predominantly Targets. I feel like out in the wild it was Targets, but he was in very low supply and rather high demand. But most recently, it looks like finally some of the shipping containers arrived across other retailers like GameStops, Walmarts, and Best Buys respectively, that now he's becoming a bit more commonplace. And I feel like out of the three, this is probably going to be the more sought after one. However, there's still a little bit of a dialogue to be discussed once we break down what's actually included in the very prestigious looking packaging that even I have to admit is kind of neat. I do like how it's a bit more emphatic on being black box as opposed to the white outlines and white accents that your traditional DC Multiverse standard base box has. So I do like that the Theatrical Deluxe Edition is having lettering very similar to that of the Collector's Edition, only this time it's blue. You have a much more emphasis on the logos where they're a little bit more blown up, but to me, my favorite part will have to be that spine with the logo of the movie Superman, but then kind of illustrated within the lettering, you see actual Corn Sweat artwork of his Superman practically being lifted from the promo material, which in my opinion is a little bit better looking than the slightly filtered look to the back art that you can tell is just a standard. It's quite literally the same art on the side, only this time kind of giving it that filtery cartoon look with Crypto there at the corner. I do like the Fortress of Solitude background, but at the same time, I never really liked that approach to the artwork that they put on the card as well as the back. I just wish that they would go with traditional promo material like illustrations or photography that was actually shot on set, etc. I don't know. I never really liked what they went with that back artwork and that style of filtering. But I digress. What we really have to focus on, though, is the figure, which, spoiler alert, is predominantly the same exact figure that we've already covered twice, and I guess you would argue is more keen to the standard version as far as the sculpting of the plastic, the lining of the texture work happening within the suit, and the specific details that call out to Corn Sweat and Gun's design for the suit in and of itself. And quite frankly, I would also say that the little qualms, the little issues that I was having as far as the proportions being a little bit too wide within the shoulders, but then having the head be just a little bit on the small side, are also echoed here for the Deluxe Edition. Not much has changed. And also likewise, the articulation is going to be mostly the same, including the little issue that I have with the back knee joints fluxing and kind of weathering a little bit of that plastic to cause a slightly bit of wear and tear, and still remarking on that bit of design flaws happening within that architecture that I really wish that they could have refined. And if anything, this guy also confirms that technically there is supposed to be a butterfly joint on the left that naturally flexes on the Deluxe Edition versus that of the Standard Edition. I also noticed that there's a significant lack of QC problems. I could virtually almost not find a single one, save for a couple of little specks here on the head and towards the side of his eyebrow. But I'll get to why exactly that is present. There could be a secondary explanation. But as far as like the bulk of the suit, I noticed that everything is feeling pretty solid. And if I wanted to put on a little bit of a tinfoil hat, I would argue that maybe there was a little bit of preferential treatment as far as the overseeing of the production for the Deluxe Edition versus that of the standard version. Because, like I mentioned before, the amount of times that I had to go through various base versions of the Corn Sweat Superman to find one that didn't have significant paint bleed or scuffs or misalignments with the eyes and the face plated, etc. And yet the Deluxe Edition got shipped in from Best Buy, and right on the first try, everything for the most part looks pretty clean and pretty straightforward with no major significant issues. And I'm thinking to myself, I wonder if we should be a little wary about that Ross exclusive that's going to be the most bare bones, most cost-effective version. And I'm hoping that maybe, just maybe, we won't be cutting any corners with the mass production of that particular release. And frankly, I feel like maybe I'll have to report on that should I come across it inside of a raw store itself. Of course, the main point of interest with the Deluxe Theatrical Edition on the base of the body is gonna be the cloth cape that is most notably swapped from the rubberized cape that the basic versions come with. And you'll notice that they went for arguably the same exact hue of red, and you got, of course, the yellow symbol, only this time it's screen printed. The quality behind the printing in and of itself, as well as the lining to kind of make these parts stand out and make it clear that it's an S right there, is pretty top notch, and kind of has to be there considering that there's no shadow to create the linings from within the rubber this time around. Makes sense. And I do appreciate that it's also wired just like various other cloth capes, except I feel like I felt much more rigid wires. I feel like we got a slightly cheaper one. It's not terrible. It's not necessarily the most loose wire or the most feeble wire that they could have incorporated, but at the same time, quite literally, I just covered a Superman figure, McFarlane Superman figure that had a much stronger, much more firm wired cape that favors posability in that of the Cyborg Target exclusive black and red variant Cyborg Superman. That guy had a really rigid wire within the cape that I love to play with. This guy, I feel like after a few dozen tries or so, it's gonna become a little weary as far as the strength that it can actually incorporate into the posability. But at least you got length to kind of give it a little bit of that waviness, kind of make him look either majestic in terms of like flight posability, or at the very least in this neutral stance to make it look very similar to that of the rubberized cape. The verdict is still kind of out the way that it's sort of applied to the top of the neck piece, where you'll notice right here that you have these secondary pieces that kind of stick out a little bit and are much more present than that on the rubberized cape. So that's a bit of a trade-off. I don't know how I feel like I said, about those little gaps and those secondary pieces right there that kind of sandwich the cape right inside, but at least you have a little bit of wiggle room in case you because right out of the box, it's kind of pulled back like this, so you're gonna have to futz and finesse a little bit of the wiring to be kind of pressed and restructured forward a bit more and to kind of curve around the shoulders to make it look a bit more natural as opposed to the way it came right out of the box, because that could be a little bit of a potential, like I said, wear and tear issue if you don't stitch it or futz with it quite right. But the cape is not the only thing that's meant to be premium included in the Theatrical Deluxe Edition. Of course, you're going to have some extra accessories that you're not accustomed to, even though you do still get the flight hands that were included with the base option. But then the big thing that is going to get people to talk about the Deluxe Edition and probably prefer it over the base version should they have the chance will be the swappable face plates, because similar to that of some prior released collector's edition figures, you're going to have the option to be able to swap out the face plates, considering that Superman actually has a hairline as opposed to the Lex Luthor, who's bald, and he's naturally going to come with swappable heads, which makes sense. It also kind of reminds me of the most recently released Strange Lives of Superman that I'm frankly still kind of on the hunt for. By default, he's got the standard expression right there that is found on the base of the head. When you give it a slight tug on the underside of the chin, that's what gives you access to removing the faceplate. Now, it is admittedly a little scary because there's a bit of squeaking, it's a bit of tightness, and to me the biggest hurdle that causes some form of concern would have to be the little traditional and iconic hair curl that Superman is known for. But unfortunately, it's kind of in the way of the faceplate, so you kind of have to give it a tug, pull it down. Give it a tug, pull it down ever so slightly by the 0.5 millimeter to make sure that you don't come off from either breaking the faceplate, damaging any of the inside nightmare fuel that is that exact interior of the head right there, or the hair curl that's right there off to the side that thankfully has gone unscathed so far. This is not wood, but I'm knocking it anyway. And this will then give you the option to swap it for the other 3 faceplates. One of them is probably the most different of them all, which would have to be the laser eyes. And that's pretty cool that you can have that effect right there. Would have been a little nicer if there was some kind of laser effect you can actually well, not really stitch, but attach or clamp to the face in some way or other. I mean, most recently, Marvel Legends has been able to nail that out of the park with some of their Cyclops X-Men figures. They got that really cool looking effect. Kind of wish that McFarlane would have taken an angle in that regard, and you'll see exactly why it is that would have been a very sweet addition to a Superman Theatrical Deluxe Edition for the price you're really forking over. Because when you get to the other 2 faceplates, The differences between the two, quite honestly, are sort of marginal, and you really have to squint to be able to pick apart exactly what it is that you're dealing with as far as differences for those faceplates. You'll notice that one kind of has a similar smiling smirk down at the bottom of the face, but then you'll notice that the eyes are ever so subtly different as far as expression. They look a little bit more determined and heroic as opposed to the softer, kinder, much more open-mindedness look to the default face. I guess you could argue that this is the face that he makes when he sees Lois Lane. This is the face that he makes when he is probably just by default or he's posing for the poster. And to an extent, that might be my preferred face, but I'll admit that he's kind of looking a little bit more like Tom Welling than he is David Cornsweet there, but I digress. And then lastly, you're left with a much more aggressive looking face, and it's only made aggressive because if you look a little carefully, you'll notice that he's got a bit more crinkling happening in the middle of the brow. And when applying it to the head, it then reveals it to be the exact same expression they gave the battle damage version that was the Target exclusive, only this time without any of the dirt and grime paint applications on the face. So he's a bit more on the cleaner side, and again, it takes much more form, if you will, when finally applying it to the head. But like I mentioned before, if you want to go for a much more distinct full quality expression that to me I think gives the faceplates a reason for existing, it would have to be either, like I mentioned before, the laser eyes or that slight in-between head. If I could find it, it's going to be this one right here. That feels a bit more determined. It feels a bit more like the Superman that you see up on the posters. And that to me is probably the one that gives a little bit more life to this version of the Cornsweet Superman that is, again, kind of coming at the form of a premium cost. And if this wasn't enough, they at least try to give us a form of a Hail Mary to justify a theatrical deluxe edition in the form of a four-legged companion. And that's, of course, Crypto. It is Crypto time. Here we have the little mini figurine for his best friend, or at least his Kryptonian, super-powered canine best friend, that is included here on the side. Very reminiscent of the recent Silver Age Batman that included Ace the Bat Hound. However, that was a whopping mega-size Bat Hound figurine included in what was already labeled a standard base Batman release for $22.99. This guy is now elevating this entirety of the set to a whopping, at the cheapest, if you manage to find it at a Target store, $34.99. Similar or practically equaling to the same cost as a collector's edition figure. And I gotta be honest, even with this nice little Crypto figurine, I don't know if that's necessarily justifying that cost, because not only is the Crypto figurine just a standard figurine with absolutely no form of articulation, the detail is okay as far as being able to sculpt the nice little bits of the fur across the body, the fluffy tail, but he is nevertheless made out of this like rubberized filament that feels pretty sturdy and strong on the inside, but once you get to like the little smaller, slimmer down parts of the body as far as the legs, paws, and the tail, starts to get a little warpy. You'll notice that he actually doesn't lay too flat on the ground. There's a little bit of imbalance as far as the way that they sculpted the paws across the board. However, a little bit of credit could be due to not only the little mini cloud cape that's incredibly cute, on top of having the little symbol embedded and screen printed on his own version of the cape, but it's also the sculpting behind the little collar with the little symbol there on the front, the little red dots across the side, and then of course that absolutely adorable face with the eyes and the choice to have the asymmetric ears, one kind of folded down and then one perked up, giving him a little bit of personality in the process. But is that enough for, again, at the cheapest, $34.99, on average about $37.99 from like Walmart, Amazon, if I'm not mistaken? And then you have the audacity of GameStop charging the full $39.99, $40 goddamn dollars for what you see before you hear. I gotta be honest, I'm not entirely sure if that is worth it. But don't mistake that being a remark on the base figure in and of himself, because I feel like that's an actual solidly well-made figure to commemorate the Corn Sweat James Gunn Superman and his induction into the DCU. When you're dealing with the base model, he's really well done as far as the tooling, the sculpting of the suit, albeit the proportions of the head is a little weird, but if you can find one with a really strong likeness and minimal QC problems like I had to kind of scavenge through, then he's kind of worth it for the $22.99 to $24.99 price range. It's the fact that they exist, whether it be the base version or the battle damage Target exclusive, that kind of puts the theatrical edition into question, because you have your cheaper options. The theatrical deluxe edition, despite having the cute, adorable crypto as well as the faceplates, they're almost like kind of baits to give some of us into that temptation, not and get blinded to the fact that there are cheaper options. It doesn't have as strong of an argument as, say, collector's editions. It's not able to debate itself. It's not able to really defend itself versus a collector's edition where your only option is to get that collector's edition. And right now, the one that's being sought after would have to be that Hawk Girl. And despite my personal opinion on what's included inside that package, that's the only real way to get that character in that form, is that collector's edition. There's a level of exclusivity, a level of prestige to that release with the packaging and matching that price. I don't think that that's necessarily the case with the theatrical deluxe edition for Supes here. And I'm not sure if it's the strongest foot to step on to kind of inaugurate this new wave of deluxe theatrical edition figures, considering that that's going to be the label that is going to be taken by the Batman Returns wave whenever that gets released. So I'll be doing something on the rare side and give 2 ratings. I'll be giving the standard release as well as the battle damage version that is the Target exclusive, considering that all you're really dealing with is a different deco to kind of favor the dirt and the grimy version of the battle damage portrayal. A 8 out of 10. It's a solid, well put together figure that I had great amount of fun playing around with, even with a rubberized cape. And sure, the theatrical edition is bringing about the cloth cape that feels a bit more premium in hand, and we're all starting to kind of get accustomed to McFarlane figures coming with cloth capes, but at the trade-off of having to deal, again, a price of 35 to almost 40 bucks, crypto and the faceplates frankly don't do it 100%, and I'll be giving him a slight little bump down to a 7 out of 10. It's a pretty decent release, but it's one that I can definitely look at the remaining theatrical edition releases, such as Lex Luthor, Mr. Terrific, and even most definitely the Robot and Ultraman, and think to myself, yeah, I'm kind of good, no thanks. And sadly makes me just a bit concerned for what's in store for that Batman Returns wave that's going to be utilizing the same labeling and the same sort of brand for their eventual release. Especially since it's already dealing with its own share of issues behind the scenes. Again, I kind of toss it up to potential licensing issues as to why it is that we haven't gotten full reveals of the figures of those prototypes, because all we've gotten is renders, rumors, and kind of buzzes happening behind the scenes, but nothing real and concrete. Hopefully that'll change come Comic-Con time, but for now, I'm a little skeptical of whether or not that wave is really going to see the light of day eventually, but only time will tell. For now, if you guys have managed to find the Corn Sweat James Gunn Superman McFarlane figure, whether it be in the standard edition, the gold label battle damage version, or even the theatrical edition, which is now becoming a little bit much more widely available across retailers, let me know what you guys' opinions are down in the comment section. And while you guys are down there, hit the thumbs up button if you enjoyed this review, thumbs down if you did not, and as always, stay humble, and I'll see you later.